Hey there, welcome to SQSR. Today we're going to answer, is daylight saving time really worth losing sleep over? The question sounds sort of simple, so let's take a look at the response. Given recent international trends and a report from Indiana, the answer seems to be no, at least here in the 21st century. But before we go any further, I have to try to correct a popular mistake. There is but one S in daylight saving time. It is saving, not savings. If it were kitten saving time, no one would have any trouble with it. But since you can have a college savings plan, and it sort of makes sense that you could save time for daylight, the extra S sort of makes sense, but no, it is the time for saving daylight. In case you are somehow blissfully unaware, daylight saving time is a scheme where clocks are advanced in the spring, or late winter if you prefer, and they're reset in the fall, or early winter. In the United Kingdom, the same scheme is called summertime, sometimes abbreviated SMT, and much of Europe uses translated versions of that name, such as the French heure d'été and the German Sommerzeit. The idea is to shift an hour of daylight from before you'd normally wake up to a time when you'd normally be awake, and then switch it back again for, reasons. DST isn't a new idea. Well, I'll let the famous documentary movie National Treasure explain.
Do you actually know who the first person to suggest daylight savings was?
Benjamin Franklin.
That's right. An essay published in the Journal de Paris on the 16th of April, 1784, Benjamin Franklin wrote that Parisians could collectively save 96 million livres between the spring and autumnal equinoxes if they changed their sleeping habits? Your readers, who with me have never seen any signs of sunshine before noon, and seldom regard the astronomical part of the almanac, will be as much astonished as I was when they hear of his rising so early, and especially when I assure them that he gives light as soon as he rises. If it should be said that people are apt to be obstinately attached to old customs, and that it will be difficult to induce them to rise before noon, I answered nil desperandum. I believe all who have common sense, as soon as they've learnt from this paper that it's daylight when the sun rises, will contrive to rise with him. This isn't daylight saving time. No, this is a joke. It's about the false economy of a lamp that gives off twice as much light by burning fuel twice as fast. So the rest of National Treasure isn't a documentary either? Mind blown. How about an actual history lesson? When Canada adopted time zones in 1891, they had GMT -5, now known as Eastern Time, as New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, and all parts of Canada lying east of Manitoba and Keewatin, not included in Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. That included everyone living around Lake Superior. But for anyone near a border, there was a bit of an overriding, avoid time changes on rail routes if you can mentality. And since the town of Port Arthur, at the western side of Lake Superior, was the eastern end of a rail line, they operated on GMT -6. A man named John Hewiston moved from Rossport to Port Arthur, and one has to presume that Rossport operated on GMT -5 at the time, because Mr. Hewiston lobbied the town of Port Arthur and the adjoining Fort William to adopt this newly named Eastern Standard Time for the summer, so that people, quote, would be able to have more time to participate in sports after work and enjoy their lives, end quote. Both towns changed from Central to Eastern Time on May the 1st, 1908, and returned to Central Time on November the 1st. Since they jumped forward an hour and then came back, they are regarded as the first real equivalents of daylight saving time. They changed the clocks, not just their sleep schedules. Take that, Franklin. Well, after changing back, Fort William apparently decided that changing clocks was stupid, but that Eastern Time was better. Because on the next May the 1st, they again joined Port Arthur in moving to Eastern Time. But Fort William just stood there and waved when Port Arthur went back to Central Time in November. Port Arthur then realized that Fort William had the smarter idea, and they permanently moved to Eastern Time in 1910, probably hoping never to change their clocks again after that. Little did they know. So National Geographic credits the idea to entomologist George Hudson of New Zealand in 1895, though he advocated a 2-hour jump. There are probably others who had the idea, but I'll give it to John Heweston since he was the first one to be successful. And there were other DST-like proposals, but the first country to enact it as law was Germany. The Bundesrat declared that the 1st of May 1916 begins at 11 p.m. on April the 30th, 1916, and that the 30th of September 1916 ends 1 hour after midnight. This is really going back to Franklin's joke of an idea, wake up earlier so you use less fuel during the day, except this time they changed the clocks to achieve it. And this was mostly motivated by World War I, and so unsurprisingly, a lot of other European countries followed suit. In 1917, the United States still hadn't even created official time zones yet, but there was already a National Daylight Saving Committee trying to get DST added in right at the beginning. Things continued at government speed, and the Calder Act, also known as an Act to Save Daylight and to Promote Standard Time for the United States, made it through Congress and was signed into law on March 19, 1918. While it didn't use the words daylight saving time, it created it. At 2 o'clock ante-meridian of the last Sunday in March of each year, the standard time of each zone shall be advanced 1 hour. And at 2 o'clock ante-meridian of the last Sunday in October in each year, the standard time of each zone shall, by the retarding of 1 hour, be returned to the mean astronomical time of the degree of longitude governing said zone. Well, World War I ended just after the first fall back, and Congress pretty much immediately wanted to end DST. Included in the Agriculture Appropriations Act of 1919 was text that would eliminate the Daylight Saving Scheme. But President Wilson vetoed it, and the House fell 8 votes short of voting to override the veto. So Congress tried again, and Wilson vetoed it again. But this time Congress overrode the veto, and so the Daylight Saving Scheme was repealed forever in the United States on August 20th, 1919. No, except of course it wasn't. Congress thought that daylight saving time was so good for the war effort that in early 1942 they moved all clocks forward 2 hours for World War II, but didn't roll them back until September 30th, 1945. Instead of Eastern Standard Time versus Eastern Daylight Time, it became EWT, Eastern War Time. Except for the couple of weeks between VJ Day and the program end when it was EPT, or Eastern Prevailing Time. So, that's it. No more DST. Oh, wait. So, while the US as a whole had stopped DST twice, the UK went ahead with Keep Calm and Observe Summer Time. Except during World War II, when they did double summertime, though their version still did a 1 hour fallback in the winter. Oh, and the US didn't stop. It just stopped the nationwide policy. Some states, or even just cities, kept up the scheme, though not always on the same schedule. After about 20 years of this, Congress decided enough was enough and recreated DST in 1966. except that states could opt in or out as a whole state. Alaska, Arizona, Hawaii, Indiana, and Michigan all said, nope. Though Alaska caved in 1968 and Michigan wibbled for a bit and then caved in 1972. In the age of the personal computer, Indiana time became famous because during Windows setup, US and Canadian citizens were presented with the choice of Eastern Time, US and Canada, or Indiana, East. When I learned that the Indiana legislature was discussing adopting DST in 2005, I actually wrote a letter to a state senator that I knew, expressing my personal dislike of clock changing and how Indiana got to be an hour closer to Pacific time for part of the year and an hour closer to London time for part of the year. The best of all worlds. That senator voted with the majority, and Indiana started to observe DST in 2006. Okay, so now we can finally answer, is it worth it? Indiana State Representative Julia Carson is quoted as saying that adopting DST would save Indiana families, quote, over $7 million annually in electricity rates alone. The paper, Does Daylight Saving Time Save Energy? Evidence from a Natural Experiment in Indiana, by Matthew J. Cochin and Laura E. Grant, did statistical analysis on electric bills for Indiana residents for before and after the adoption of DST, and found that they saved $8.5 million a year in electricity. Wait, why is it in parentheses? Oh, it cost them $8.5 million a year in electricity compared to not doing DST. Looking further into the paper, it turns out that coming home from work or school earlier in high summer means you turn on your air conditioner sooner. And apparently, when it's light late in the evening in the cooler months, you somehow spend more on heating than you otherwise would have. So every time people extend the duration of daylight time, they're actually making that part worse. The recent trend, despite the Indiana paper, seems to be to adopt permanent DST. Morocco did in 2018, except during Ramadan. And several states have passed initiatives saying that they would if the federal government would allow it. It's funny because I don't remember that being a power granted to the federal government from the Constitution, though they probably claim it falls under interstate commerce. And in Canada, British Columbia has said that the spring forward they just did is the last time they're changing their clocks. Fans of late summer days that oppose permanent DST sometimes argue that fall back is good because it means it's light out when children walk to school in mid-December. That comment usually seems to come from places at the western end of a time zone, and well, maybe you should just pick your permanent time zone to be no DST. On the day of the summer solstice, it doesn't get dark in Seattle until 10:48 p.m. It doesn't need to be that late. Some of us have to get up in the morning, you know. Ooh, bonus interesting fact. In my personal experience, the region that complains the most that permanent DST would be bad for the children is Indiana and Michigan. So why is that interesting? Well, when the US first standardized time zones in 1918, both of those states were in Central Time, not Eastern. Over time, they both moved to Eastern, aside from a handful of counties in each state. So really, when they do daylight saving time, it's actually double DST based on the sun. With this video already being notably long, I won't even go into the physical health and psychological health aspects of clock changing, or whether permanent DST or never DST is theoretically better, especially because the answers are going to be, it depends. So, there you have it. Daylight saving time has a strange history, and it is certainly controversial. The best possible control group study, looking at you, Indiana, says that it costs money rather than saves it. So for me at least, it's not worth losing sleep over. And unless you happen to be a member of a legislative body, it's probably not worth losing sleep over the controversy either. See you next time for another simple question and perhaps a shorter, simple response.